Okay, great. Welcome everyone, and thank you, Kathleen, for joining us tonight. Kathleen's going to talk to us about the Scottish Wildlife Trust Living Landscape projects. Dr. Kathleen Thomas is the Living Landscape Programme Manager at the Scottish Wildlife Trust. Kathleen joined the Trust in March 2020, and for everyone's memory, that March 2020 was quite a famous day. It was the start of lockdown, so it turned out to be quite an experience when it came to starting a new job. Kathleen is passionate about protecting wildlife and giving animals a voice in decision making. She's experienced in managing and leading ambitious conservation programs to protect our most vulnerable native species. She worked for the RSPB, leading Europe's largest hen harrier tagging program, and led the UK's largest red squirrel conservation project. Kathleen has a diverse background with a range of experience across relevant fields, including ecology, scientific research, education, engagement, communications, media work, policy, and project management. She finds that the best way to tackle global biodiversity loss is to bring together a range of disciplines and approach problems from different angles. The Scottish Wildlife Trust has three living landscapes: the Coherence, the Cumbernauld, and Edinburgh. Kathleen is going to tell us a little about the principles that underlie the living landscape approach and gives examples of what that looks like, with the focus of the Edinburgh living landscape and the development of Edinburgh Nature Network. Over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you. Okay, can you see my presentation now?
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. Right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Nick, and thank you for the invitation to come and join your group tonight. It's been quite interesting to hear about what you get up to. So yeah, I'm gonna. So my talk's kind of split into two halves. The first part is really just a bit of background about the living landscapes, what they are, and what we do with that concept at the Trust. And then the second part of the talk, I'll focus a bit more on Edinburgh. So specifically talking about the Edinburgh Living Landscape and then the development of the Edinburgh Nature Network, which is a project that I've been working on over the last couple of years. So just to give you a bit of background and explain what we mean by a living landscape. So this concept really focuses on managing land at the ecosystem scale. So what we're trying to do is benefit people, wildlife, and the economy, trying to deliver landscape scale conservation and restoration. Because and this idea kind of came from the recognition that conservation really needs to move beyond nature reserves and consider the full landscape and all of the factors that are influencing wildlife and people. And that isn't to say that nature reserves aren't valuable, obviously they are, but we need to go beyond wildlife kind of being constricted into those reserves and being much more integrated into our landscape. So essentially, yeah, we're trying to make a place where wildlife and people can thrive. And we have open spaces that are bigger, better managed, and more joined up. So this is really just a little illustration to show you that sort of what that concept might look like. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but hopefully you can read the slide. So what you can see here, we've got this core area of habitat in the centre. So in this case, a woodland. We can connect it up through corridors, either linear corridors or more complex landscape corridors to other areas of woodland, or to areas where we can restore a woodland habitat. There's lots of other ways we can connect the habitat. So we can have stepping stone habitats, which is kind of small patches of habitat rather than a big woodland. It might be sort of small patches of trees and hedges. And we also need to have buffer zones around those areas where wildlife can be sort of free to move around. And that's how we can benefit everybody by having these better sort of joined up spaces. So rather than having all of our greenery concentrated just in a reserve and then that's surrounded by concrete, which we do, well, you probably know we do have that a little bit within Edinburgh at the moment. But the idea is just to integrate that greenery really. And so this really came out of was sort of consolidated with the Lorriston report in 2010. which was actually based on England and sort of their model of nature reserves, but it's still applicable to us in Scotland. And so what we're trying to do is create landscape scale conservation with a joined up network of wildlife friendly spaces so that wildlife has more space, more room to maneuver, and it just helps support those natural processes within the habitat. So at the Trust, we have 3 living landscapes, as Nick was saying. So we have Coherence, which is in the northwest of Scotland. That's our largest living landscape. And then we have 2 in the central belt. So we have Cumbernauld living landscape and we have Edinburgh living landscape. So the approach that we take to the management, as I've said, is ecosystem based and it's landscape scale. So what that means essentially is, so we're not focusing either on single species or single habitat restoration projects. We're trying to look at the whole ecosystem together and thinking about everything, all of the living things within that environment, but also the environment itself. So thinking about the climate, the earth, the air, everything within that space to try and deliver a coherent, a coherent piece of work where we can work at multiple scales. And so having this joined up approach helps us really tackle those threats to biodiversity and prioritize use of resources, because obviously we're limited in terms of time and money and, you know, all of these constraints. So it just helps us to focus our activities. And as I say, it helps us really tackle those main drivers of biodiversity loss, things like climate change, habitat fragmentation, unsustainable land use, which is, you know, we see too often, unfortunately. And it's all built around, so the UN's 3 pillars of sustainable development. So by managing land at the ecosystem scale, we can benefit the environment, we can benefit society, and we can also benefit the economy. But it needs to be at a much bigger scale than anything we've done before, really. So trying to support the natural habitat, but also social and economic needs within an area. So rather than having this conflict between what humans want from an environment and what wildlife needs, we can try and find synergies and work together. So our principles at the Trust, so the living landscape concept is kind of was developed by the Wildlife Trusts as a whole movement. At the Scottish Wildlife Trust, we've sort of focused our living landscapes around 5 different principles. So first of all, as I've said, needs to be at the ecosystem scale. So at that scale, we understand what the threats and challenges are to the health and resilience of the environment. We have the opportunity to make changes, so we can change and inform land use and how it's managed. We have strong partnerships, so all 3 of our living landscapes have really strong partnerships with a range of different types of organisation, and we all are working towards shared visions within those different areas. So each area has its own vision that's applicable to that area. And we can demonstrate what the benefits are of restoring those environments and having that long-term capacity. So it's a long-term project to restore the ecosystem at scale. So we need capacity both within our partner organisations, but also within the community, because really what's key to making these living landscapes work is that the local community can support their development, but also benefit from them. So having that capacity to engage in creating the living landscape and developing it over the long term. So the next slide's a little bit processy, but might help some people to understand. I've got some more slides coming that are a bit more illustrative. So if this doesn't suit your way of thinking, just ignore this for a minute. But essentially, so the way the Living Landscape programme works, so within each of our 3 areas at the moment, we've got externally funded projects that we're running. So in Coherence, we have a landscape partnership scheme that's going to be coming to an end soon. And that looks at, there's 4 different parts to that project that I'll talk about with some nice pictures in a minute. Within Cumbernauld, we had a couple of different funded projects. So we've got a project called Creating Natural Connections, which is our sort of big NLHF £2 million project within Cumbernauld. And then we had a Green Roots project that finished at the end of last year, which was around improving access within Cumbernauld. And then in Edinburgh, so the funded project we've got there at the moment is called Thriving Green Spaces. So just in case you've heard any of these names floating around and you're wondering what they might be, it's just the sort of the names of the funded phases of those different projects that we've got running at the moment in each area. So I'll just touch on briefly Coherence and Cumbernauld, and then we'll delve a bit deeper into Edinburgh. So with Coherence, so that partnership was established in 2011, and there's a vision to 2050 around improving the landscape within that area. The current funded phase is the Landscape Partnership Scheme, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. That finishes next month. It's a community partnership, so up there we've got a range of landowners and community interest groups and environmental NGOs that are involved, and that is our biggest living landscape. So it's 635 square kilometres, and it does include some of the rarest and most endangered habitats that we've got in the Highlands. Altogether, there's 30 different projects within that partnership scheme. So this is just a flavour of some of the different things that we've been doing. So we've got some general sort of path maintenance and improving accessibility for people to get into some of these areas. We've got projects around sort of the built and cultural heritage on the northwest. So looking at things like the historical fishing bothies and net sheds and restoring them and making them more sustainable, installing different things like solar panels and heating systems that can that will make them more sustainable into the future, renovating and repairing various parts. There's been archaeological projects looking at the history of the area, and various sort of wildlife habitat based projects as well, doing surveys. So the Natural History Society in the area have been quite active within the project and looking at surveying different parts of Coherence, so we can see what wildlife we've got there, and then we can better understand what we need to protect. So if you're interested in Coherence, we do have a website. The address is there. I would suggest you get on there and have a look. There's been a lot of books have come out of this project. We've had projects around the music and tales up in the area, traditional song and things like that. And there's various bits of videos and things on YouTube. So if you want to delve into that a bit more, start with our website and that'll send you to the right places, hopefully. In Cumbernauld, so Cumbernauld is obviously a very different landscape to Coherence. Cumbernauld is the biggest town within North Lanarkshire, and the living landscape that we have there was also established in 2011, and we have a 30-year vision with our partners there. The current project that we are working on is called Creating Natural Connections. Again, that's funded by the National Lottery and runs until next September. This one's a partnership between Scottish Wildlife Trust, the Council, TCV, Sanctuary and JHI. It's a smaller area, so it's only 59 square kilometres in the town. I think the population of Cumbernauld is about 50,000 people, so it's more people, but a smaller area. But we still have some really important habitats in that area, from ancient woodlands to peat bogs. And again, this just gives you a flavour of some of the different types of projects that we've run. In Cumbernauld, again, looking at paths and accessibility into the green spaces and how we can connect them up better for both people and wildlife. We've worked with schools and community groups to help engage people with the natural environment. We've got Habitat Works, and then we've got our Wildways Well programme, which is our sort of mental health work within Cumbernauld to sort of support people's mental health by understanding how they can use the green spaces. And we've also got our Nature Ninja volunteers who help us with our habitat maintenance, and they do a great job helping to clear invasive species and all sorts of things. So again, if you want to know more about Cumbernauld, we've got a website for that. And then just coming on to Edinburgh. So the Edinburgh Living Landscape, that started in 2014, and we've got a vision to 2050. I'll talk in a minute in a bit more detail about the Thriving Green Spaces project, which runs until December next year. That started out as so Edinburgh Living Landscape started out as a partnership between the Wildlife Trust and Edinburgh Council, but we were quickly joined by other organisations, including ELGT, the Botanics, the University, Butterfly Conservation, RSPB, Nature Scott, and then we had TCV join us last year as well. Again, slightly bigger area. Population of Edinburgh is about 500,000 people, but then way more tourists, as I'm sure you all know. But in terms of sort of the environment here, again, you know, we've got really important habitats. We've got peat bogs, really rare lowland dry heath, various bits and pieces. We've got water of leiths are really important, you know, historically important to the city, but also an important habitat for wildlife. So again, it's a really interesting place to work. And we've had a range of projects that have been delivered through the Edinburgh Living Landscape Partnership. And I know some of the people here today have, well, Tim will know way more about these than I do. And I'm sure there's others of you that have been involved. I recognise a few names on the participant list, so I'm sure some of you have been involved in some of these projects. Again, we've got a website if you want to have a look, and I'll show you a little bit later on how you can find that and how you can use it. So what I want to talk about really in terms of Edinburgh Living Landscape is just a little bit more detail about how we've developed the Edinburgh Nature Network. So thinking about Edinburgh and our vision. So the vision here with the partnership is that we're trying to make sure that nature is at the heart of the city. So I was reading recently, I think it's just under front of Edinburgh is actually green space, although I think it is golf courses. So yeah, it's really interesting understanding how popular golf is within Edinburgh. But I'll come back onto that maybe a little bit later. So within the partnership, so our vision in Edinburgh is that nature is integrated into those neighbourhoods across the city, and that as a partnership we can demonstrate using case studies where you can invest in the natural environment and it can deliver both, well, for wildlife, but also for people. So helping to deliver socioeconomic outcomes as well. And we hope that by 2050, we've created healthier places for everybody and contributed to Edinburgh being one of the most healthy cities in Europe. So that brings me on to the Nature Network. So from what I can understand, the way that Edinburgh Living Landscape has worked up until now, well, and continues to work, is that we've been quite opportunistic in terms of identifying projects to deliver, which isn't to say that they aren't good projects, because they are. We've delivered some fantastic work across the city and, you know, created a new park within Little France Park. There's a huge amount of work has gone on, but it's been a little bit led by the funding availability or led by staff capacity. So there was a real sort of desire from the partnership to have a more sort of strategic approach to the work that we were delivering within the city, and to help us really to meet those living landscape principles and improve the environment at scale. Having that more strategic, coherent approach will really help us to focus resources. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail as to how we've develop this, but I will just sort of touch on the different aspects of the Nature Network. So essentially what the Nature Network is a long-term strategic approach to help us to manage, restore and enhance the urban environment within Edinburgh. And what we did was, so we worked with a huge group of people to identify opportunities for action across the city where we could use natural solutions or nature-based solutions to address the threats of biodiversity loss and climate change, benefiting people and wildlife. And so that has resulted in the Nature Network, which is providing us with evidence to make better informed decisions in terms of project delivery, which I'll come on to later on. And also helping us to prioritise actions and secure funding. So the first question, I guess, really is why would we try and do this in Edinburgh? Well, why did we try and do it all? Sometimes I wonder. But the reason we chose Edinburgh, obviously, it's the capital city of Scotland. Environment, it's a complex environment. We've got lots and lots of landowners, so not just each homeowner within the city. But you know, we've got the council who own huge amounts of land, we've got private estates. So we were focused, so our Edinburgh Living Landscape area focuses within the City of Edinburgh Council boundary, which is that red line on the map. And yeah, we've got some iconic sort of places within the city. We've got the castle and Calton Hill, but we've also got some really interesting environments. We've got about a third of the city is bounded by the Firth of Forth, and then the other 2/3 are obviously terrestrial boundaries. And then yeah, just some really amazing landscapes. So it felt like and with having the Edinburgh Living Landscape Partnership there as well, it felt like a good place to trial a nature network. And the idea as well now is that, so now that we've trialed this within Edinburgh, we can share our learning with other local authorities to develop nature networks within their own cities. So places like Aberdeen and Dundee can use our methodology to develop their own nature networks. So in terms of its development, so we had a working group with people from a variety of organisations. I'm incredibly grateful to everybody that sat through all of our online workshops, because it was a slog. We had to move everything online because of the pandemic. But yeah, glad that everybody stuck with us. And I think, yeah, you'll see with the outcome, hopefully, that it was all worthwhile. So we approached a range of organisations to get involved. So you'll see we've got local partners, but also regional and national partners with a range of interests as well. So not just people working in sort of the conservation or environmental sector, but also people from the health sector, crime prevention, and yeah, we've got sort of government, local authority, environmental, NGOs, a whole range of organisations. And so what we did was we used something, so this is the technical bit. I've tried to find other ways to say ecological coherence protocol, but it's essentially, it's about having that coherence in the environment. So it's taking that landscape scale approach so that the work that we're doing is coherent, is joined up. So using that decision-making process, what we did was we looked at 3 aspects of the city. So we looked at the habitat network, we looked at the ecosystem services that are being provided by that habitat network, which I'll explain in a minute what that looks like. And then we looked at something called opportunity areas, which again, I'll explain in a minute. And essentially what that did was gave us a set of opportunities for action at a single site within the city that provides multiple benefits for people and wildlife. And that's how we get to the nature network. Sounds easy, doesn't it? So in terms of the habitat network, so again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but essentially what we did was, so we worked with the University of Edinburgh and mapped the key habitats that we find within Edinburgh, and then categorized them into broad groups. Which just allowed us to look in a bit more detail. And these maps, so I know they look quite small on this screen, but when we did our little workshops, we zoomed right into various areas of the city and looked at the habitat in more detail. So we held 3 workshops because that's how long it took to get through all 7 different habitat types that we have. And with our working group, we identified the areas where we wanted to protect different types of habitat, where we wanted to enhance it, connect it up, restore it, or create it. So you can see we've covered the main habitat types, and the types that we've picked also link to, so there's other wider habitat network mapping projects across Scotland. So for example, the Central Scotland Green Network have a habitat network. So we use the same categories as them, just so that all of the work kind of fits together. But we did add in a category because we were applying the work to an urban landscape. We added in this urban category here. And so that includes things like churchyards, cemeteries, allotments, and the green corridors that we have in Edinburgh. So the cycle network, things like that. And this was all taken from publicly accessible data, so using the HabMOS data set, but then also we were able to access government data as well. So we got information from the council and from SEPA and CEH and a variety of places. So we got a really comprehensive map of all of the habitat types. So just to give you an example, so if we were looking at, you can see with the heathland, peatland and bog, as you would expect, most of the peatland within Edinburgh is up in the Pentlands and the surrounds. So we, for example, we would look at, well, you know, what quality is that habitat? Do we need to restore it? Does it just need enhancing? Do we just protect it as it is? And so these are all the kinds of questions that we asked our working group. And then we also looked at, so ecosystem services are essentially are the services provided by the environment that humans benefit from. So things like having good quality air, so our air purification, having clean water, so that's our water purification, regulating the temperature within the city, ameliorating flooding, things like that. And so we again worked with the university to map all of these different things. So we mapped capacity, which is the areas within Edinburgh where those services are being provided, and that's shown in purple on these maps. And then we also looked at areas where those services are in demand, which is the orange colours on this. On the maps. So again, as an example, if we look at flood regulation, you can see that we've got a lot of purple capacity here where the Pentlands are. So all of that peatland has a lot of capacity for storing water, which prevents flooding downstream. And again, so we held another 3 workshops with our working group, and we zoomed right into these maps and we worked through all of them to see where people felt there was potential to, so looking at implementing natural solutions, so particularly where we had demand in orange, so where we needed extra provision of services, asking our working group what that might look like and what we could do. And we also, so these two, so health and wellbeing and insect pollination were 2 ecosystem services that we actually developed within this project. So health and wellbeing essentially is a measure of various factors, but includes things like how close people live to a publicly accessible green space, because obviously that benefits both physical and mental health. Also looked at things like the social index of multiple deprivation, Scottish index of multiple deprivation. And then the insect pollination measure, again, was a measure of provision of pollinating services, basically. So where there's demand, where we've particularly got farmland around the edges of the city, there's more demand for insect pollination. And then the last thing we looked at was opportunity areas. So within the city, we looked at designated sites. So these are sites that are either sort of legally designated as being places for particular wildlife or species. Also included local nature reserves and Bush Wildlife Trust's reserves. So as well as things like triple SIs and SPAs. And we also included the local biodiversity sites that we have in Edinburgh. But then on top of that, we mapped where all the council's parks and green spaces were. We mapped out development sites, mapped out the open spaces on the NHS estate, all the golf courses and the school grounds. So essentially what we were looking at is all of these sites have the potential for us to make a change to improve the environment. So it was really just assessing them all through our workshop. So again, asking our working group where they felt that any of these sites could be improved or actually just needed protecting as they were, because they were actually quite good quality. So it's about identifying places where we can make a change. So after those 7 workshops, what we ended up with was a map like this. So each of these dots is a comment that was provided by one of our stakeholders. So having gone through 7 habitat maps, 7 layers of ecosystem services and opportunities, we ended up with about 2,500 comments across the whole city, telling us where people, and the benefit of this as well is that the people that we were working with have local knowledge of the city. So having them tell us where they thought things needed improving was really beneficial, and just took the work to the next level. So we weren't just relying on sort of static maps of habitat. We were actually able to use people's up-to-date knowledge of those sites, which was fantastic. So then what we had to do is to turn that into an action plan, basically a list of activities, because having 2,500 suggestions for action is quite unmanageable, really. So what we did, so we had a project officer, Donya, who worked through all of those comments. So she looked for each of those suggestions. She compared it to the habitat maps for the area, the ecosystem service maps, where the opportunity areas were, and then it also then looked at the feedback that we had from the stakeholder, from the working group, to bring together things into some cohesive actions. So you can see these are the different map layers that she went through. So we go from lots of dots in an area to sort of more individual actions. So having these geographically specific or site specific activities that need to take place. So just to make it a little bit more manageable, so we ended up with 200 actions across the city, and you'll see some go into the further Forth as well. To make it a bit more manageable, we grouped them into 5 different types of action. So we have connect actions, where we want to connect up 2 or more areas of existing habitat. So an example of that is planting trees. If we've got a couple of different patches of existing woodland, we might want to plant some trees in the middle to connect them up a bit better. We've got create, which is about creating new habitat where we don't currently have any. So a good example of that is creating a rain garden or a soakaway, or basically just drainage, natural drainage on sealed surfaces. So for example, where we've got roads or other sealed surfaces, we can use planters to absorb some of that water to prevent flooding. We've got enhancing actions, where we're trying to enhance an existing habitat. So we might have a habitat type there. We might have, so for example, what we call amenity grassland, which is kind of like, if you imagine like a football pitch. So it's that really short grass that we have, and it's sort of usually just a single species of grass within it. So we can enhance that and turn it into, for example, a native wildflower meadow, or turn parts of it into a wildflower meadow so that we can support pollinators. So rather than being a monoculture of grassland, we've got a much more biodiverse area. We've got protect actions, which, as the name suggests, is just about having that we've got an existing area of good quality habitat, and we just need to maintain it and protect it as it is. So for example, the lowland dry heath that we have within Holyrood Park, we just want to maintain that because it's already in good condition. And then restoring is about restoring a habitat that we used to historically have, but it's just been lost through development or through land use changes. So a good example of that is restoring the peatland up in the Pentlands, where it might have been drainage ditches might have been dug through the peatland, or maybe the heather's been burnt, so the habitat isn't as good quality as it could be. So we're trying to restore it back to what it should be. So I'm aware that's all quite theoretical and potentially not too easy to envisage what that looks like. So what I'm going to attempt to do now is to show you the nature network. And I think the question that, or the what Glenn was just saying earlier about having lots of volunteers at the university, hopefully this might give you some ideas of what you can do with those volunteer days. So if you just, I'll just show you how to find the nature network. So if you go to your search engine of choice, if in Edinburgh in landscape, see how quick my internet is tonight. So it'll bring up, so we have an Edinburgh Living Landscape website, edinburghlivinglandscape.org.uk. And if you click onto that, that brings you up to here. So just while we're on here, I'll just show you a little bit about how the what's on the website. So we do have, I try and keep our project news up to date. And if any of you have any news that you'd like us to include, then please feel free to send it over, and I can pop it on our website. So if you want to know the latest of what's going on in Edinburgh, you can see it there. There's a bit more information about the living landscape. And if you scroll down, you can click through the different projects that we have been running and read a bit more about them. But for now, so I just want to focus on the nature network. So you'll see there's this section at the top in the header bar that says nature network. And so if you click onto that, that will take you to this page. So this really explains a lot more about the nature network, what it is, why we need it, how we developed it, and how it will be delivered. So let me see if I click on how it will be delivered. So essentially, we've developed a nature network. So we've got 200 actions for work across the city. But for it to be successful, we really need to work in partnership. So it's about building on that living landscape partnership that we've got. And we've already expanded into this much larger working group. So we've got a lot more organisations that are involved now. And we're also keen to work with volunteers as well. So we've got a few friends of groups that come to our working group meeting. Well, we've had one working group meeting so far, so we're going to meet quarterly. We have working group meetings where we can just share progress, really share updates, ask for if there's any advice people need on implementing any particular work. Then it's a good forum to sort of bring forward those kinds of questions. But yeah, it's really, we sort of need all the help we can get, kind of thing, in terms of delivering the nature network. But I think hopefully the most useful bit, so if you click through into the maps, you can see, so we've got all of these actions. So if I just zoom in, I'm just gonna, so normally what I would when I give a talk is that I would prep information for the place where I'm giving the talk, but since we're all online, I didn't really know which areas people would be interested in. So I thought I'll just focus on Princes Street, because I hope everybody knows that to some extent. So you can see if we zoom into Princes Street, you can see we've got some actions in here. So if you click on these little markers, it gives you more information about the activity or the action that we like to see in there. So this action here is for Central Edinburgh, and it's a connect action. So the information is that we'd like to see the existing green spaces being connected up. So if you look at the wider map, we've got Princes Street Gardens, we've got Calton Hill, we've got Holyrood just on the edge here, and then we've got the meadows just a little bit further down. And you can see that they're actually quite big green space as well, especially Holyrood in and of itself is quite a big green space. But between them, there's very few sort of green corridors or links for wildlife and to be able to travel between those four big sites. So, and obviously one of our living landscape principles is about connecting up these habitats. So what we'd like to see is a bit more greenery, really, between those habitats. So what I'd like to show you, so you can see up here when you click on an action, it gives you in bold, it gives you a location. And what you'll hopefully see along the top is that we've got all of these different areas across the city where we've provided a lot more information. So if I click on Central, There's a little bit of just information about what the centre of Edinburgh looks like. It zooms you into that place on the map, but you can also click in to get more information. So we've prepared documents which give you, so I think there's 22 different documents for different areas of the city altogether. You'll see, so there's just, excuse me, there's a summary of what's in that area. There's also a bit more information about the habitat network and the ecosystem services within that area. But what it does, it gives you the list of all of the different actions that we'd like to see. So for example, in the centre of Edinburgh, we'd like to see wetland habitat being restored in the meadows, because that was drained in the early 20th century. We'd like to see some wetland habitat being restored in Princes Street Gardens and enhancing the Amenity Grassland. As I've said, connecting up some of those green spaces, enhancing areas where, so there's a lot of sort of cafes and pubs and restaurants that have plastic plants and things. So it'd be nice to see them being enhanced as well. So there's a huge range of actions. And if anything takes your fancy, we've also included a list of organisations that work in that particular area, or places where you might start to make contact with people if there are any activities that you might like to take forward, or if you just want to know more about it, you can contact those different places. So let me just jump back into my talk, because I'd just like to show you, I'm just aware I've been talking for quite a while, but I'd just like to finish up with an example. So I'll just skip through the Holyrood part, because I don't want to keep you too late. And just talk a little bit. So the one of the projects that we've been involved with at the Trust is a project called Rewilding the Mound. So Lloyds Banking Group approached us because they wanted to improve their space, basically. So the Mound is Lloyds Banking Group's headquarters within Scotland. And you can see, so this is a photograph, so you might be familiar. So this is the museum on the Mound, and you've got kind of Waverley and Princes Street Gardens to this side, and you've got the castle just up here, and then Johnson Terrace Reserve is just behind that. But you can see on their site, so there's a lot of concrete. They've got a lot of this sort of just plain grass that's obviously being mowed quite regularly. So they asked us to help them to improve that area. And as I've touched on, so the location of the Mound, it's in the centre of some of these larger areas of green space. So it's a prime position really for us to connect up habitat at some of those sites. So I'm just going to skip over that bit. So what we did, so we gave them basically a list of recommendations for the site using the information from the Nature Network. And part of what we did was to help to create stepping stone habitat within that site. So even though the Mound is relatively small compared to some of the larger green spaces in that area, we were able to work with Historic Environment Scotland and Butterfly Conservation Scotland, and we designed a meadow mix of plants that they could put into that area. So we wanted them to improve the grassland by incorporating meadow species within that, and identified species that would support the northern brown argus, which at the moment is only found at Holyrood. But we're hoping by establishing additional habitat in the surrounds of Holyrood that we can encourage them to spread a bit further around the city. But also looking at other locally rare and important invertebrates that they had there, like stonecrop fanner. And they also wanted to include interpretive signage at the Mound. So we've provided some information to help them to design that. So that, because really what they want is to showcase what can be done in that kind of site, so that the public can do their bit for wildlife as well. We looked at, so there's quite a lot of artificial light on the site at the Mound. So we've worked with them to try and reduce the artificial light pollution that we have in the city centre, which and actually they were really receptive to that, which was good. We suggested creating a green wall, which helps to provide air purification and also temperature regulation, as well as providing a habitat for a range of wildlife. And we also gave them some recommendations for bat attractor planters. So a mixture of native wildflowers that would attract insects during the night, which would act as food for bats. And again, positioning them near the trees so that the bats can shelter in the trees and then come down to feed. So the work is still ongoing. So when we went for a site visit in January, so this is an area of the site just out of the museum on the mound. You can see it's very concreted, nobody's really sure what, so there's a hedge there, but nobody's really sure what species of plant that is. We couldn't work it out, and they didn't know either, but I don't know if you can see as well, it's planted in a kind of blue gravelly glass type substrate for some reason. But already, so in January, that was completely revamped. So the plants now have been planted out. The hedge has been replaced with native hedging, so hawthorn, blackthorn, things like that, like a mixture of native plants. And I'm hoping as the weather warms, we'll get some wildflowers starting to come up. So it's already a vast improvement on what it was before. And I'm hoping by January 2023, it's going to look even better. And then there's also quite a lot of other projects that have been taken forward already through the Nature Network. So I've already mentioned the mound. At Lorriston Farm, so they've looked at the information that we've got. So Lorriston Farm is up in the sort of the north side of Edinburgh, and they're wanting to tackle the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss, but also lack of access to fresh, affordable food. So Lorriston Farm is a historical agricultural area, but the soil is quite degraded in those fields. So they've been looking at our Nature Network information, and they're going to do some habitat creation up there. And they've just had some money from Nature Scott to do that. We worked with the LGT, so they are creating they're wanting to improve a sort of walking and cycling route from the Pentlands to Portobello, which you can hopefully just about make out on this map. And again, looking at particular sites along that route, using the Nature Network to identify what types of action would be helpful to just naturalize that route, to remove invasive species and to support biodiversity. You may already know, so I think there's been about 7 wee forests planted within Edinburgh. So these are sort of tennis court sized urban woodlands, and again, they've used the Nature Network recommendations to try and identify the best places for tree planting. So that's quite a big partnership project led by Earthwatch and Nature Scott, with the trees are being planted by ELGT and TCV to try and provide additional tree cover and benefits for local communities. One thing we've done, which is quite important, is actually influencing the local development plan. So the council released their City Plan 2030, which outlines the development and sort of proposed planning conditions for the city for the next 10 years and beyond. So we were able to integrate the findings of the Nature Network within that, so that nature-based solutions are really included in developments from the outset. And it's something that the developers are really being challenged on to incorporate biodiversity into their plans. And then finally, the council are doing some master planning for 3 of their parks, Leith Links, Inverleith and Inch. And again, using those Nature Network recommendations about improving the types of habitats that they have there, and helping to connect up so that wildlife can go beyond the park into kind of the surrounding areas using green corridors, but also then that benefits people as well, because they've got a much nicer neighborhood to walk around. So it's great that quite a lot of these things were already being taken forward before we'd even finished pulling together all of the information for the Nature Network. So just in summary, so what we've done is create this long-term strategic approach for managing the urban landscape within Edinburgh. It's the first time that we've really applied this kind of methodology to an urban environment, and we kind of know why. Having battled through it, we can see why nobody else tried, but we got there in the end. So because of the pandemic, we were forced to host all of our workshops online, which was a joy. So we learned lots of new tools and techniques for engaging with people. And actually, I think it did increase the participation because it meant that people could join from home. They weren't trying to travel to particular sites or sort of set aside as much time in their diary. So I think in hindsight, it was actually quite useful doing it online. We've now got a map of the habitat network as well as the ecosystem services within the city. And it's not just theoretical and based on the maps, we've also incorporated that local knowledge. And it means that we can apply for funding from a more strategic place rather than being quite so led by funding opportunities, although obviously we are still able to take advantage of those where they appear. And yeah, it's the first time that we've managed to include environmental considerations, actually have it written into the local development plan so that developers have to think about natural solutions to biodiversity loss. So yeah, I think that's it on the nature network. So I just want to finish by thanking you all for listening. I know it's quite late at night, so thank you for sticking with me through all of that. If anybody has any questions, I think I've still got time to take some, but otherwise my email address is there. And just thank you to everybody who helped to create the network. I know there's a couple of you in the audience tonight, so thank you for your help and everybody else that helped us pull all of that together.
Great, thank you very much for that talk, Kathleen. Fascinating. I really enjoyed the whole process. Like, starting on quite broad, as to what you do across the city, but really just delving into a bit more detail in Edinburgh and seeing, just how it all sounds quite exciting, and all the information, the wealth of information that you've managed to pull together sounds quite encouraging, and equally as a good guidance for people that want to get stuck in, really. So it's very good. Yeah, no, thank you. Are there any questions that people might wish to ask Kathleen? We've had a comment, so
yeah, Glenn's just wanting to pick up on some stuff. Yep, that's fine. Yeah, I can drop you a line, Glenn. Let me just copy your email across, because I think once I leave the meeting, I'll lose all of the chat.
Thanks. I did want to ask a quick question. I think that's worth, for the whole group, really. I mean, firstly, well done for initiating this during the pandemic and for doing so in an urban environment, and getting getting this rolling. You mentioned methodology a number of times, and I did wonder whether you're familiar with sort of action research type methodologies that are about learning through changing the system. And where I'm going with this question is that one thing I'm trying to challenge the university to embrace is the 30 by 30 principle. So I've got a dissertation student currently mapping our hedgerows on the vet school campus, and that's a change initiative in itself. When you showed that hedge up on the mound, it hasn't been lain, so there's no horizontal habitat in this a lot of hedges could have. And so I guess I kind of wanted to sort of articulate that, but specifically with regard to the 30 by 30 stuff, I think if a lot of these big landowners kind of engage with the question of, well, what might it look like for 30% of our land to be protected for wildlife, and for us then to explore the interconnections between nature and human well-being. The stuff kind of just, you can just imagine it sort of all actually people getting drawn into that because they can see those interdependencies.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in quite a good place in Edinburgh. As I say, I think it's something like 46% of our land is actually open space. So we're already well above that sort of 30% target. But I guess for me, I think where the difficulty comes is just because the sites are designated for nature doesn't actually mean that they're doing a good job for nature. So quite a lot of our, so those designated sites, places like, so SPAs are quite often designated as sites to be protected for particular breeding birds, for example, but nobody actually checks whether that's the case, whether those breeding birds are actually doing well or not. Well, I mean, you know, local groups like yourselves might have people that keep records, but from a sort of government statutory agency perspective, actually trying to make sure that the way those sites are looked after is that they're actually in favourable condition and they're actually delivering for wildlife. I think for us that's the challenge, is making sure that that open space that we have is actually doing what we need it to do, and that, you know, and I think that's where sort of touching on sort of some of the golf courses. So, you know, obviously parts of the land are set aside for golf, but actually having trees and hedges around the boundaries, or, you know, having wildflower meadows, rather than it just completely being, you know, that amenity, like, you know, that really short grass, that monoculture of grass, actually can really help to improve that environment. So I think that's probably the challenge for us in regard to having that land set aside for nature.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess that the you know, when I look at that 47%, I'm seeing, you know, a single digit figure rather than a 2-digit figure that's being conscientiously managed or cared for with a view to promoting biodiversity. I mean, just looking at the number of university properties that are on water courses running through Edinburgh, they're not conscious of what they're putting into those water courses and how the aquatic environment is affected. So there's a whole load of stuff that can happen there, but I think once there's an engagement, it will just start to ramp up. Yeah,
definitely. And I think one of the, you know, that's really come through in this work as well is, you know, things like Water of Leith, which you know, is kind of, so we've got various organisations like Water of Leith Trust, Conservation Trust, who sort of look after the full length of it, but then you've got sort of developers come in and they might do something at one part, and like you say, they don't always think about the knock-on effects downstream. Or, you know, we've got invasive species that if they're in one part of the water and they're not being dealt with, they'll just spread downstream. So I think, yeah, it's that approach of having that sort of landscape scale coherent approach. So it's not just thinking about, oh, well, in my backyard it's fine. It's, you know, it's thinking about how that impacts the wider environment, isn't it? That I think we've still got a little way to go in terms of the discussion around wildlife, really.
Kathleen, I've got a question by Penny McKee, who says, how do you include private gardens and allotments, and what is a million tree project? Now, the million tree project's been, someone's copied the
I can see Annie's put,
but if you want to touch on those two things quite quickly, that would be nice. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so a million trees is probably the quickest one to explain. Yeah, so thank you, Annie, for putting the link in. It's basically Edinburgh Million Tree City. The project is to, as it says, to try and have 1 million trees in Edinburgh. I think last count we were up to about 850,000. So it's a big tree planting initiative basically being led by the council. But those tiny forests, the wee forests, are part of that as well. So that's contributing to the number of trees we have in the city. In terms of including private gardens and allotments, so at the moment we've included them in the sense that we've mapped them and we know where they are. We had quite a lot of conversations about what we do, you know, how do we sort of deal with those types of sites, because you know, some people just pave over their garden completely. Other people have really biodiverse spaces. Some people don't have any gardens as well. You know, in Edinburgh, I think it's 1 in 12 people have a garden, which isn't very many. So thinking about how we would incorporate those spaces. So at the moment we've mapped them, but I think what I'd like to see, so some of the actions that we've got are around engaging with not just residents to promote sort of the way that they manage their gardens and that they're supporting biodiversity and having that sort of wilder garden, but also working with so quite a lot of the larger spaces are managed through sort of landscape gardeners, and also engaging with them again to talk about managing those larger sites for biodiversity. So I think there's probably still a bit of work to do, and if anybody has any bright ideas about the best way to try and engage with the residents of Edinburgh to encourage them not to cut their grass and, you know, let their gardens get a bit wilder, that would be really useful.
I guess thanks. I guess it leads on to what opposition are you getting to this kind of concept, especially in an urban setting? I know you've got, for example, London National Park as a concept for bringing establishing this. But is there an opposition to this kind of idea of integrating nature and creating an ecological network at the heart of a city?
I guess not. So one of the things that's been tricky with the pandemic is that we're not really seeing we've not been able to engage with the general public in the way that we would have otherwise. So what we would have done through this process is done some public consultations. We probably would have gone to a park and said, you know, this is the nature network, this is what we're thinking of, what do you think? So we've sort of lost, at the moment, we've not really been able to do that, but we're hoping to do a bit more of that in the next phase of the project. So I'm not quite sure specifically how this piece of work would go down with the public. I think, you know, from talking to colleagues, what we are seeing, you know, in Edinburgh is this sort of urban creep. So it's this continued development and continued concreting over and these sealed surfaces. So I guess it's not specifically opposition to this idea, it's just the way that green spaces or spaces within the city are being developed and you know, and revamped. Although a lot of the plans that are sort of coming out now, they do incorporate nature a lot more. You know, when you see these impressions, they actually have trees in them now, or sometimes there's flowers in them. So we're sort of making good progress there. And I think, I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of this is, so I don't know if you'll have seen, they're looking at pedestrianising George Street, which is like a couple of streets back from Princes Street. And the artist impressions for that kind of, it was still very concreted, but my understanding is that, so because it's part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, that actually limits what you can do to the environment. So you can't just plant, you know, big trees and things like that, which throws up quite an interesting conflict there in terms of, you know, like, are we preserving the new town the way that it was built and originally designed, or, you know, is there some flexibility in that, you know, actually we're in a climate emergency, we've got huge amounts of biodiversity loss, so can there be allowances to allow us to improve the greenery in those streets without losing, you know, because obviously that World Heritage status draws people into the city. So I think they're probably some of the kind of conflicts that we're identifying at the moment.
Thanks. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask Kathleen? No. If you don't mind, I might have a follow-up one, like a little bit of a last one, and then I'll let everyone go and thank everyone. It's just given the cost of living crisis popping up and what's happening in the world, like, you know, just fuel price, we have food prices going up through the roof. How much do you think the environment's going to remain central to people thinking, or is it going to be kicked on the curve because we've got, you know, so to speak, more important things to matter, despite the fact that, you know, we are in the middle of a climate and biodiversity crisis or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, yeah, we've certainly got, you know, parts of Edinburgh where people are much more concerned about whether they can heat their house or whether they can feed their children. And I think, you know, for them, that's always going to be their top priority. I think, you know, we've sort of seen really over the last sort of, what are we now, sort of 10, 15 years, that environment has dropped down. Certainly in terms of sort of funding and things, but I mean, it's hard to know. I don't have a crystal ball, so I'd love to know how things are going to change in the future. I think, I mean, you know, I've certainly seen in the last sort of 4 to 5 years of my career that, you know, like when I started, we were trying to get people interested in the environment, whereas now it's, you know, it's in the news constantly and you can't get away from it. And, you know, particularly from a climate perspective, it's on people's minds. And I think, I mean, there, you know, obviously, well, so I guess one of the benefits maybe of fuel prices being high is that hopefully people will choose to use fossil fuels less. So they, you know, we've seen an uptick in people buying electric cars. So whether that will, I mean, I don't know how much better they are for the environment, because then you've got lithium batteries to dispose of, but we'll not get into that. But hopefully, yeah, if people are starting to think a bit more about how they travel. But I can see, I mean, you know, like we know that you can fly to Spain probably cheaper than you can get a train to Glasgow, you know, so that side of things, I think we need to redress, you know, how we subsidize the aviation industry and things like that, because yeah, if you've not got the money and you want to go on holiday, it comes down to purely cost, doesn't it? So you can't factor in, you know, if you factor in the environment, you just never go anywhere. So I think until the system makes it easier to make those environmental decisions more cost effective, I think it's always going to be difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, no, indeed, it was a tricky question, but thanks for good. So Colin Brown asks, has any thought been given to planting food trees and plants? And after this one, I'll call it a day.
Yeah. So some of the things that we're recommending in terms of, so I feel like there's a lot of focus on tree planting. There's been a lot of focus on meadows, but I think hedgerows have kind of not quite had their time in the spotlight yet. So, you know, we've been recommending planting hedgerows with food plants, but also sort of fruit trees within that. And, you know, a lot of the work that they're looking at Lorriston Farm is around, yeah, providing food plants. You know, we've got a lot of like wild brambles and wild garlic and things like that along, so along a lot of the cycleways, there are food plants there. You do think about it in the context of both people and wildlife, you know, and having those berries. And I mean, some of it comes down to the management. Like I've got some hedgerows near me, and they were being cut off, you know, trimmed back just as the berries were coming out. And I just thought, oh, why don't you, you know, give it another month, give the birds chance to eat the berries and then trim it all back then. So some of it's down to what you plant in the first place, but some of it is just down to those management techniques and making sure that the food's available at the time that it's needed. So yeah, trying to think about how people, I mean, yeah, I quite often see people foraging when I'm out walking around the city. So I guess it's just making people feel comfortable with that and knowing that what they're identifying and that it's safe to eat, isn't it?
Great. Thank you very much again, Cathleen, for a fascinating talk, and thanks to you all for coming along. It's been a very I've certainly learned a lot and enjoyed hearing about the initiative. I wish you every luck going forward. Maybe you'll see me pop up and try to give a hand in some way. So, you know, don't forget, you know, living groups like that, you know, just to help you out with some of your work for sure. And but thanks very much, and have a good evening, everybody. Bye.